The ultimate tragedy of ending your life is not the cessation of pain. It is the systematic de-rendering of consciousness itself. You do not just go to sleep. The biological reality is a terrifying mechanical process. Your decaying brain traps you in a locked-in state. It forces you to consciously spectate the deletion of your own reality. This shutdown happens frame by fading frame. Your prefrontal cortex remains fully online, but your sensory inputs begin to mathematically fail. You are forced to watch your own neural pathways collapse in real time. A man sits at a perfectly functional traffic light. His hands physically grip the leather steering wheel. His pupils dilate rapidly. This is not a physiological response to acute fear. It is a biological reaction to a chilling absence. He detects zero saccadic eye movement in the world around him. His neck muscles mechanically contract. He turns his head to check the rearview mirror. His gaze immediately shifts to the passenger window. He is actively scanning for the microscopic physical data of human existence. He searches for the physical blur of a passing tire. He looks for the photon glint of a windshield reflection. He registers absolute geometric void. The biological scanning mechanism fires continuously. The optic nerve desperately seeks contrast and movement. The external environment simply returns zero input. The hardware runs the search protocol in an empty room. But here is the brutal physical reality. When the physical body is destroyed, when bone impacts a concrete sidewalk from a fatal height, the biological shutdown is never instantaneous. What exactly happens in the neural pathways during that microsecond lag? The brain chemically realizes it is dead. The oxygen supply drops to absolute zero, yet consciousness remains temporarily trapped inside the failing hardware. The initial stage of a fatal event does not induce peaceful rest. It does not trigger a sudden, quiet fade into black. It triggers a systematic, hostile takeover of your neurobiology. The event mimics severe physiological trauma and sensory dissociation. It creates a terrifying biological paradox. Your brain becomes acutely hyper-aroused, but you are mathematically locked out of the sleep cycle. You are awake, but your hardware is malfunctioning. Look closely at the mechanics of catastrophic physical trauma. The autonomic nervous system immediately detects a lethal physical threat. It bypasses all conscious thought and triggers an extreme dorsal vagal response. This forces profound bradycardia across your entire vascular system. Your heart rate violently plummets to bare survival levels. Complete metabolic suppression begins in a matter of milliseconds. Simultaneously, the brain forcefully floods its own architecture. It pumps massive, toxic doses of endogenous opioids. It releases highly potent ketamine-like neurochemicals. This chemical flood physically severs the somatosensory cortex from your tactile feedback loop. The peripheral nervous system simply stops sending afferent signals. The nerve endings in your shattered bones no longer communicate up the spinal cord. The signals permanently fail to reach the parietal lobe. The subject physically feels as though water is passing straight through their own tissue. The brain desperately attempts to initiate the physiological sequence of sleep to escape the trauma, but the reticular activating system is completely jammed. It is locked in a permanent electrical state of terminal shock. You cannot pass out. Observe a severe trauma patient lying flat on a clinical stretcher. Their respiratory rate drops rapidly and mechanically. They pull exactly 6 shallow breaths per minute. A nurse applies a freezing wet cloth directly to their bare forehead. There is zero muscular flinch. There is absolutely no vasodilation in the facial tissue. There is zero pupillary response to the sudden drastic temperature shift. Their eyes remain entirely open. They are locked in a fixed, dead, unblinking stare. The motor cortex completely fails to initiate the electrical command to physically close the eyelids. The biological hardware refuses to shut the blinds. Their hyper-aware consciousness is trapped inside a frozen, paralyzed shell. The individual becomes a prisoner of pure, inescapable hyper-lucidity. They are entirely stripped of physical agency. They cannot move a single millimeter of muscle tissue. They are forced to experience raw, unfiltered, biological terror. They suffer total, systemic sensory deprivation, and they are forced to endure it without the biological mercy of unconsciousness. But this terrifying tactile numbness is merely the beginning. It is just the brain's first defensive perimeter falling. The actual fatal mechanism is far worse. The true horror begins when the brain's primary rendering engine runs dry. It starts when the visual cortex runs completely out of oxygen. As the dying brain is starved of blood, reality does not simply fade to black. It devolves backward through human evolutionary perception. The external world actively collapses. It degrades into low-resolution, textureless geometry. The human brain operates strictly on a predictive coding model. It actively renders the physical world frame by frame. When catastrophic ischemia occurs, the blood flow instantly stops. The occipital and parietal lobes rapidly run out of fuel. They completely deplete their stores of adenosine triphosphate. The rendering engine mathematically fails. The actual fatal mechanism lies in the VC visual cortex. This specific neural network processes complex textures and colors. It is highly oxygen-dependent. Because of this, it is the absolute first system to critically shut down. The brain is forcefully downgraded. It is forced to rely entirely on the primitive VC area. The VV cortex only handles basic edge-gen detection and stark contrast. This is exactly why the external environment structurally changes for the dying subject. The room around them devolves into white, textureless blocks. The environment completely lacks 3D-dimensional depth. The biological hardware literally loses the physical processing power required to render reality. Observe a pilot inside a testing centrifuge. They are experiencing extreme G-force induced hypoxia. Their peripheral vision aggressively collapses inward. The visual field rapidly tunnels into a narrow, dark tube. A technician instructs them to press a bright red button on the complex dashboard. Watch the pilot's physical mechanics. Their hands grasp erratically at completely empty air. They miss the physical target by exactly 6 inches. They blink rapidly. They desperately attempt to focus their failing retinas. They are asked to verbally describe the highly colorful dashboard directly in front of them. They describe the complex instrument panel as completely flat and gray. Their vocal cords lose tension. Their voice immediately drops into a mechanical inflection, less drone. Their fundamental spatial awareness completely disintegrates in real time. This is the total biological collapse of 3-dimensional spatial awareness. It is the total deletion of color perception. The fading consciousness is now completely isolated. It is permanently trapped inside a simulated, rapidly shrinking geometric void. But the physical world, devolving into a blank canvas, is just a visual failure. A far more lethal and intimate collapse is occurring internally. It is the irreversible, biological severance of your thoughts from your emotions. True psychological annihilation is never the absence of thought. Your brain does not just quietly power down. It initiates a catastrophic decoupling process. It aggressively severs your logical cognition from your limbic system. Your intellect remains completely intact, but you are rendered biologically incapable of feeling your own thoughts. Look closely at the actual neurobiological failure. The uncinate fasciculus physically deteriorates. This is the critical white matter tract in your brain. It is the physical bridge connecting your emotional centers to your prefrontal cortex. When this bridge collapses, you develop profound acquired alexithymia. Your own internal dialogue suddenly feels like a completely foreign language. You can still perfectly process syntax and grammar. Wernicke's area continues to pass the data without issue. But the emotional valence is completely dead. The amygdala and the insular cortex stop generating emotional weight. Your cognitive recognition software violently disconnects from your emotional hardware. This replicates the exact clinical mechanics of Cotards syndrome. It triggers the terrifying biological conviction that you are already a walking corpse. You are a ghost operating a mechanical shell. Observe a clinical psychiatric patient suffering from profound affective flattening. They sit entirely motionless in a medical chair. A clinician places a physical photograph of their own child directly on the desk. Watch their facial mechanics. The patient's facial muscles remain completely flaccid. There are zero micro-expressions. There is absolutely no activation of the zygomaticus major. The orbicularis oculi muscles surrounding the eyes do not twitch. The patient speaks in a completely flat, unvarying monotone. They state clearly that they logically recognize this is their offspring, but they report absolutely zero internal physiological response. Look at their clinical biometric readouts. Their heart rate monitor displays a perfectly flat 60 beats per minute. There is absolute zero heart rate variability. The biological machine recognizes the visual data but physically feels nothing. This is the ultimate psychological solitary confinement. You possess the complete intellectual capacity to mathematically observe your own death, but you completely lack the neurochemical hardware to actually grieve it. You no longer have the biological capacity to care. It is only inside this sterile, emotionless vacuum that the terminal irony reveals itself. The very suffering we desperately seek to escape is not a biological error. It is the exact mechanism that keeps us alive. Human consciousness does not exist in a peaceful vacuum. It is intrinsically anchored by biological friction. It requires physiological stress. It actively demands negative valence to operate. Without the raw presence of biological and psychological pain, the concept of self mathematically cannot exist. Look closely at the actual mechanics of your brain's reward circuitry. It simply does not function on absolute states of peace. Neurological peace is a biological dead end. The hardware operates purely on deltas. It only registers rapid changes in state. The insular cortex processes acute physical and social pain. This exact neural structure is deeply integrated with the generation of your self-awareness. Cortisol is not a systemic poison. Inducing stressors are your baseline, evolutionary survival signals. The noise, the chaos, the heartbreak. These are not bugs in the system. When a subject permanently removes all external threats, when they successfully delete all internal friction, the default mode network suddenly has absolutely nothing to push back against. The subjective experience of reality physically collapses. Consciousness fundamentally requires the physical tension of suffering to maintain its structural integrity. Observe a highly stressed individual navigating a crowded, noisy city street. They subconsciously clench their jaw. Their eccrine sweat glands activate slightly under their clothes. Spikes of cortisol actively elevate their baseline heart rate. They physically flinch at the sudden, violent blast of a car horn. Their chest muscles physically tighten as they anticipate a direct confrontation. Look closely at this exact sequence of physiological events. These are biological microfrictions. These are rapid autonomic nervous system spikes. This is the precise biological anchor. It is continuously confirming their physical boundaries. It is the exact mechanism actively proving their physical existence in reality. This leads to a paralyzing, irreversible realization as the brain dies. The chaotic, painful variables of human life were never obstacles to existence. They were the actual, load-bearing pillars of consciousness itself. You destroyed the foundation to escape the weight of the roof, but the tragedy of the terminal plunge is strictly mathematical. This profound neurological realization always arrives at a precise point in time. It arrives exactly 1 millisecond too late. The ultimate horror of ending your physical life is a profound biological myth. There is no peaceful release. There is no quiet, painless exit. The physical leap from a fatal height does not yield immediate peace. Gravity accelerates the physical mass of your body. The skull structurally shatters against the concrete pavement, but the electrical shutdown of the cortex is mathematically delayed. This delay traps your rapidly fading brain in a subjective eternity. You are locked in a permanent state of sensory de-rendering. Your final, inescapable cognitive state is not relief. It is a desperate, violent desire to reverse physical time. It is a mathematically impossible biological craving. Your isolated consciousness suddenly craves the exact same suffering you just destroyed yourself to avoid. You beg for the noise, you desperately need the physical chaos, because that neurological friction was the only proof you actually existed. But your physical hardware is now permanently broken. The game's outcome cannot be altered once the brain tissue is destroyed. You simply fade away in total neurological isolation. Your final conscious microsecond is spent begging for the pain to return. Stop viewing your severe anxiety as a systemic failure. Stop categorizing deep frustration and psychological pain as biological bugs. They are not glitches in your neural hardware. They are your fundamental, hard-coded operating system. When you feel completely overwhelmed by the unbearable chaos of your physical existence, do not attempt to intellectually numb the sensation. Do not attempt to permanently shut the hardware down. Force an immediate, extreme physical grounding protocol. Take physical action immediately. Submerge your bare face completely in a basin of solid ice water. Hold your breathing there. The sheer thermal shock forces a massive physiological override. It forcefully triggers the mammalian dive reflex deep inside your brainstem. This forces a violent, immediate parasympathetic reset of your entire vagus nerve. It violently drops your heart rate and forces your autonomic nervous system to physically reboot. Tolerate the brutal, heavy friction of daily life. Embrace the biological weight of your allostatic load. Your visceral, immediate suffering is the ultimate biological proof. It physically proves that your organism is still fiercely fighting to exist. Dead matter does not feel friction. If this breakdown completely shattered your comforting emotional illusions, if it forced you to directly confront the brutal, mechanical reality of your own physical existence. Subscribe to this channel right now. We do not offer comforting physiological lies. We do not prescribe toxic empty positivity here. We dissect the cold, hard architecture of reality. See you in the next one.